Welcome to Bitcoin Fixes This, where we explore the impact that Bitcoin will have in all aspects of society. Today's guest is George Mekhail, former pastor and one of the co-authors of my new book, Thank God for Bitcoin. We talk about Christianity and Bitcoin, including subjectivism, missions, church culture, and natural law. We also explore parallels with Christ and the right attitude we should have towards Bitcoin. This is an episode of Listener Questions. As you'll find out, the people who ask these questions on Twitter will receive a signed copy of Thank God for Bitcoin. Fair warning, there's a lot of questions and content about Christianity up ahead. I hope you enjoy this episode. George Mekhail, welcome to the show. How's everything going?
Everything is great. Thanks for having me, Jimmy.
Yeah, we've obviously written a book together and everything, and we're here for, answering some listener questions and things like that. But let's, before we begin, I just want the audience to know who you are. What's your background? How did you get into Bitcoin? And, what led you down this rabbit hole?
Sure. Yeah. So I got into Bitcoin in 2017. So bought at the previous all-time highs, about 19K, which is always fun to do that for about 3 years as people look at you, wondering what you're, starting to get really into and why. It's been nice having sort of the vindication of new, fresh all-time highs. So that's been exciting. But I guess before that, I was in full-time ministry. So my background is I was an executive pastor for a while for a large evangelical church in the Seattle area. And before that, I was actually kind of bouncing around in the evangelical sort of church world. Spent some time in Calvinism at a church in Seattle called Mars Hill, led by Mark Driscoll. And then before that, I was in the Coptic Orthodox Church, which is the oldest church. We claim to be the oldest church. Some Catholics might dispute that. Some other Orthodox groups might dispute that. But it's the one of the oldest churches in the world, and basically founded in Egypt, and where I was born. And it's about 10% of the population of Egypt is Christian. The other 90% is Muslim. So I was born into a Christian family, and I was a deacon in the Coptic church. And so my journey basically through Christianity, I think, was colored by my desire to fit in with my friends and sort of become Americanized as an immigrant, wanting to fit in, wanting to kind of speak the language, attended Young Life in high school, that kind of thing. So kind of left the Coptic church for a more Americanized religion. And that's kind of how I found my way into the evangelical church, but always just wanted to, be a part of what was going on in the church movement. My relationship to God is always very dynamic. I was always trying to listen, always trying to figure out what God wanted me to do in the world. I remember when I was 18 years old, I got a tattoo on my arm that says "Thy will be done." It's a cross, and it says "Thy will be done" on it. And so God's will is this thing that I've been pursuing my whole life, looking for truth, seeking out truth. And sort of 4 years ago, I just started becoming pretty disillusioned with the church. Started asking a lot of questions about just like really practically speaking, what are we doing? What is this? What are we showing up for? What is the actual message of Jesus calling us to in our everyday lives? Is God still active in the world? And if so, what does that look like? Because as I look around, and I asked my friends, my coworkers, there seems to be a lack of hope. There seems to be a lack of purpose. And so when I started asking a lot of those questions, honestly, that's kind of in a roundabout way what led me to Bitcoin and to the conversations we started having, which led to our Bible study and eventually the writing of this book.
Well, so let's dig into that just a little bit, because I think it's that sort of like spiritual malaise that you're talking about, and sort of feeling that the church isn't all that it really should be. I think is a familiar thing for a lot of Christians. Although I'm sure there are atheists that are listening to this or that are like, what are you talking about, or something like that. But let's dig into that just a little bit. what is it about that you see sort of in common with, say, or what contrast that to sort of like the Bitcoin community? Because I know we've had conversations about this, and this is one of the things that really attracted you to Bitcoin.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think the church at large, and just generally speaking, has been captivated by just the fiat disease in general, this constant need to pursue material things and, celebrity status and the next, whatever it is, building or, influencer or sneakers, have become like really mainstream Christianity popular. And so it's just like, what are you guys doing? Why are you calling us here every Sunday to just gather a bigger and bigger group to just preach another message that's like basically like a self-help talk or motivational speaker speech? Like it's just there's no direction, there's no sense of purpose. It's read your Bible, pray, and then trust God, but there's no actual practical outworking of that in the real world. And what I'm talking about is obviously the not just the broken economy, but broken politics, broken social social situation where we can't have a conversation about really anything with anybody who disagrees with us anymore without it turning into hatred or broken relationships or whatever. And so the sense of community just wasn't really there. It seemed like this church existed in order to perpetuate itself and nothing more. And I think I would contrast that to the Bitcoin community. And I know even just saying Bitcoin community is controversial for a lot of people, and I get that. It's I think we don't use that word very well in our culture, and there's a lot of that leaves a lot to be desired. A lot of people have been hurt by community, and a lot of people have been hurt by church. A lot of people their perception is they've been hurt by God, right? And I think this makes a lot of people uncomfortable because we haven't dug deeper. And what that looks like now, I think, is people discovering that as Bitcoiners, we have this common ground about us. We have this starting point that is kind of like at the macro level helps us like view all of our other problems in a way that is hopeful, right? If we can start with Bitcoin, then maybe we can solve some of these other things that are a little bit further downstream.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's definitely something that we've noticed about the church is that a lot of the life has sort of been drained out of it, and that the leak might be caused by fiat money or something like that. And that's obviously something that we discussed a lot about and ended up writing a book about. But yeah, let's. All that is to just sort of like set up what we want to do today, which is to answer some listener questions about the book, and maybe just sort of like go back and forth on some of the interesting things that our listeners mention. By the way, if we mention you on this podcast, you are going to get a signed copy of the book from me. So that hopefully will be motivation for next time for you to ask good questions and so on. So let's start with this one, and you mark this one, so I'll read it for you, and then you can respond to it, and I'll give my take as well. Sure. But Adam Lehman at Lehman_Adam on Twitter asks, is Bitcoin the one world currency used in the end times?
Yeah, I love this question because I think it's very common. Actually, I've heard this among people who are Christian first, and then you get them, you start talking about Bitcoin to them. And this question sometimes comes up if you're into end times theology, which a lot of evangelical Christians can be. I would say that no, it's not. In fact, I would say that the fiat currency, I would say the US dollar is probably closer to the one world currency used in Revelation. If you recall the verse, it basically is talking about the mark of the beast, which is a biblical reference actually to currency. If you think about marks or notes, it's currency that basically is money that you can't spend without permission from one central authority. No one. So things Revelation. Let me see here. I have it up. Revelation 13:7. It says, so that no one may buy or sell except he who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. So what it's saying is you won't be able to transact unless you have this mark, right? So people think of it as like a mark on your forehead or some sort of tattoo or microchip or whatever. But it is referring to money, and it's referring to money that you need in order to do business or to transact in the coming world, right? In these quote unquote end times. So that doesn't describe Bitcoin, right? Because Bitcoin is fully decentralized. But what it sounds more like is this centralized fiat currency.
Yeah, and this is something that we definitely touched on in the book, is that if you look at the verse, it's clear that there's a trusted third party in every transaction. And as we know in Bitcoin, that's something that doesn't exist. In fact, like something like Ripple is way closer to something like the mark of the beast and not Bitcoin. So in that sense, that fear, I think, is quite misplaced. There are other people that sort of interpret that verse not so literally, but as something like, mark on your head, something that you believe, and mark on your hand, something that you do. Multiple interpretations of that, but there are certainly people that do take that literally. And if it is, then I don't think you need to worry very much, because Bitcoin is the exact opposite. It'd be kind of like saying, is gold the one world currency used in the end times? That would be kind of ridiculous, because obviously gold is very decentralized, especially if you're trading it physically. Although, it could be if there were an intermediary that you had to trust in order to transact with gold. Another one that we had is from @MKLad. On Twitter. How much of an influence do you think subjectivism has had on creating the fiat conditions of today? Do you think Bitcoin rejects postmodernism's subjective understanding of truth and is in some ways a return to an objective standard? Quote unquote, my truth versus quote unquote, the truth with a capital T.
Yeah, that's a good one. My boy MCLAD, I think, is asking a very astute question. And I'm not sure how connected it is to fiat, but certainly what Bitcoin does deliver is a record of the truth that everyone can agree on. I mean, this is the whole point, really. I like to think of nodes, Bitcoin full nodes, as witnesses to the truth that's happening on the blockchain, right? And you could even go as far as to say as they're witnesses in the cloud. They're clouds, right? I think that's a biblical reference, but I don't know. What do you think about this one, Jimmy?
Well, so I've thought about this quite a bit. And my current thinking is that fiat money is sort of like a tool of positivism, and that's sort of like a legal theory. And I wrote a tweet about this today. And most people don't really understand the difference between natural law and positivism, or what either of those things mean. But let me just diverge for a moment and explain what those are. Natural law is this idea that we have rights as human beings, right? And these include the right to life, to liberty, to property, to the pursuit of happiness, and all sorts of things like that. And if authorities take those away from you, then the government is being immoral and you have the right to rebel and so on. This is the justification, for example, in the Declaration of Independence. Positivism is sort of the opposite, or an alternate view of law, which says that you need to be explicitly be given a right in order to have it. So there are no quote unquote human rights. It's something that the state decides to give you or not. And that leads to all sorts of evil. You can imagine a trivial example would be something like the government telling you, hey, you don't have the right to cut someone's hair for money. You need a license in order to do that. And so it's a right that the state gives you through a license. And if you don't have that, then you're in violation, even though from a moral perspective, that seems kind of stupid. And many people that want to cut hair and not have a license kind of say that. But it can get a lot more serious. And we can see that in like some of the worst governments in the 20th century, many of them just said, you don't have a right to life. You don't have the right to liberty. So they either kill you or jail you, right? You don't have the right to property. So they take all your stuff. You don't have the right to, pursue happiness. So they make you go do a job that you don't want to do. And that is sort of like the philosophical difference between the two. And we've gone away from natural law towards positivism. And in part because it's very convenient for the people that are in charge. It's very easy for them to just say, hey, like we're positivism is the right way, because then the government can do no wrong. They have no moral culpability if, for example, they decide to jail someone or kill someone or take away their stuff or force them to do stuff that they don't want to, and so on. And most governments have been trending in that direction. So all of that is to say that fiat money is a form of positivism. It's basically saying it's putting the lens of positivism on money itself and saying, well, you don't have the right to this money. You instead, we control what your reality on this money is. So the government can, for example, print a lot of money and dilute whatever money you have and sort of take it away without even you knowing about it, in a sense. And that is a very subjective version of the truth, because the government or whoever is in authority gets to decide, hey, this is what reality is, and we can change it at any time. It's a very subjective reality. And if you read about like the show trials in communist Russia or whatever, you hear about all of these things where people were forced to confess to ridiculous things that they never did. It's sort of like turning the truth on its head. There's no objective truth anymore. The truth is whatever the authority tells you the truth should be, and that's a very subjective truth, and that is very postmodern, and it creates sort of these conditions that are very akin to what fiat money does, which is that authorities have control over everything. Bitcoin is very much going away from that and saying there is an objective truth, and no one gets to decide now that the truth is something different, right? And that, to me, is the key to this question. And I really do think that Bitcoin does return at least money to an objective standard. And if you have money that's an objective standard, then the rest of the market, the rest of the economy starts becoming a lot more rational, instead of sort of created in the image of some bureaucrat or some authoritarian that wants to impose some vision on the rest of civilization. So in that way, I do think that Bitcoin starts bringing about more truth with a capital T, because truth with a little t, enhances truth with a capital T. What do you think, George?
Yeah, I like that. I agree with everything you're saying, and I think the only thing I would add is how we go from a world where value is subjective with fiat currency to a world where proof of work is what backs how people are going to, allocate value, and that to me is, I think, adds a level of capital T truth to how humans interact and transact, and once that begins to underline all of our interactions, then you actually have a vision of a beloved community, to use another church phrase, right? Is people are now interacting and transacting in truth. It's not just this random, like, I can work so hard all day, 9 to 5, 60 hours a week, and earn a pittance, while the government is printing money for free, basically, like no labor involved. What is that, right? That once that dynamic goes away, and it's just everybody is working and earning for the same sort of pool of available Bitcoin, then you have a level playing field. And when you have that, then I think everything just begins to change.
Yeah, and money starts representing something a little more truthful, right? Like as a result of that, instead of it representing, some money printed by some bureaucrat or possibly 60 hours of backbreaking labor somewhere, it instead starts representing the value that it actually added to civilization. And that's something that we point out in the book is, like money, that's what money's supposed to be. It's supposed to be a representation of how much value you've added to someone or something, and enhance civilization, instead of, this murky water of, okay, well, it is for those people, but the privileged people, it's basically you get all of that credit without actually doing anything, and that, in a sense, is a currency of lying, right? Like it doesn't represent work or value added at all. It actually represents theft, and it's actually horrible. And that to me is a key part of what Bitcoin is supposed to be.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
All right, let's move on to the next question. Viking King 447 from Twitter asks, how might Bitcoin adoption assist with getting funds to missionaries around the world? High wire fees are a waste to kingdom funds to further the gospel. So what do you think about this issue of sending money to missionaries and so on? What's your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, certainly getting money, moving money around the world, moving value around the world with Bitcoin is a huge advantage, something that I've been able to experience firsthand, just sending money to my aunts and uncles in Egypt through my cousins, right? That without having to get bank accounts and all this other crap that was required previously. Like, it's night and day, the difference that it makes when you're able to just send money with no third party. And so the question of whether or not getting funds, from the U.S., let's say, to missionaries overseas, I think is certainly relevant. I would take it a step further and say that it's probably going to make us ask even deeper questions about missions in general, right? Like, what are these missionaries that were sent there under sort of a different, I guess, paradigm, right? Of need and resourcing in this fiat world. How is that going to change now entirely, right? I think about Bitcoin Beach doing amazing work in, I believe it's called El Zonte, El Salvador. And they're basically building a community. They're building a city from the ground up, founded in a Bitcoin economy, a Bitcoin circular economy. To me, that's what new missions looks like in a Bitcoin economy, in a Bitcoin standard. So I would definitely, if you haven't heard of Bitcoin Beach, I'd encourage you to look them up, and because I think what they're modeling is a beautiful example of a holistic Bitcoin circular economy that is, in a lot of ways, the new mission field, if you will.
Yeah, good points. For me, thinking about missions is tricky because, in a sense, like a lot of the quote unquote closed countries, or the countries that are very difficult to get in for missionaries, for example, they tend to be the most hostile to, the US dollar hegemony, right? And, there's a reason why there are sanctions on Iran or North Korea, for example. And those are, two of the most closed countries in the world. And in a sense, fiat money has sort of created that artificial barrier. It used to be that missionaries just sort of could go wherever. Now we have all these political barriers, largely due to currency and things like that, and authoritarian governments that have so much power as a result of fiat money. So I do wonder, kind of like what you said, like what does missions look like after you get rid of all this artificial sort of fiat borders and things. The reason why it's the US and like first world countries that send all these missionaries is because, in a sense, they're all benefiting from some form of the Cantillon effect, and they're able to accumulate money or like earn money in one area, which gets to print the money first, and then spend it where it's it hasn't kind of inflated yet with dollars or whatever, and that's sort of like the advantage and why you have the flow of missionaries that you do. I honestly wonder, like, if you did have a level playing field, how many missionaries would come out of, like, say, India instead of the United States or Brazil or even Nigeria or something like that. The flow is sort of like presupposes sort of like a hierarchy of, like holiness or something like that. But this is like exactly the opposite of what it actually says in the Bible. Don't judge holiness by how rich people are, and where you happen to have been born and what currency you use determines a large part of, where you are among the global elite. If you're born in the United States, you are almost certainly going to be in at least the top 5%, probably the top 1% of the world. And certainly if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably in the top 0.5% or even higher. So in that sense, it's, I honestly wonder, like, maybe we've like calculated everything wrong in missions. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think missions as they exist today are largely a byproduct of the fiat economy, and a lot needs to change, frankly. So I completely agree with you.
All right, let's take a look at another question here. Control Alt BTC on Twitter asks,
great handle, by the way. Sorry.
In the context of the Bible, how does followership gel with the strong Bitcoin notions of self-sovereignty, liberty, freedom of access, and self-agency? Oh,
that's a tough one. Oh, man. Okay, where to begin? I guess. Okay, so something I've been thinking a lot about is, we have this notion in Christianity where we talk about Jesus and the salvation freeing us. Jesus freed us, right? Freedom in Christ. And kind of like what I was talking about earlier is I like to get really, really pragmatic, really practical with what are we talking about here? What does this mean for my life today? What does Jesus free me from today? And I think that I've been answering this question with kind of what's overtaking the world right now. And as I look around, I see that fear is taking over the world right now. We are afraid to leave our homes lest we get the coronavirus, or whatever. It's fear that has just completely captured us. And I think fear is very much anti-Christ. Fear is anti-freedom. And so to kind of build on this question a little bit, I think that it is the freedom from fear, right? And all the way to, I think what Jesus accomplishes in his story of resurrection is freedom from the fear of death specifically. Okay. And so I think that there is something to be said about all these themes that Bitcoiners embrace: self-sovereignty, liberty, freedom of access, that is very connected with the biblical narrative of Christ. And I think that how to make that connection to Bitcoin is something that I'm still working through, to be honest with you. I think this book really helps, like just by accepting Bitcoin as this gift that sort of just kind of came out of nowhere, and we don't really fully know its origins. Like there is something that ties the two together, but freedom is at the heart of, I think, both narratives. I don't know. What would you say?
Yeah, it's interesting that the Control Alt BTC called it like followership, because in a sense it's talking about. I think what Control Alt BTC is talking about is more the sort of like the structure of the church, right? There's a tendency for, and I'm sure you're familiar with this. You go to any church, the church starts taking on the personality of the head pastor. That's it. Anytime you have a switchover or whatever, you get sort of that personality, and a lot of the congregation sort of self-selects to be aligned with whatever that person believes, and there's a tendency towards sort of like almost a groupthink a little bit, and like Control Alt BTC is contrasting that with self-sovereignty, self-agency, freedom of access, liberty, and all of that. And I appreciate the question, because it is pointing out that reality that there is, in a sense, some level of, well, what you could charitably call community, but what you would call sort of less charitably as sort of like almost like a suspension of the teleological or something like that, as an atheist would say, and instead just sort of like go all in because you finally have some place to go or something like that. I believe that to be true in some aspects, and I believe that to be true in some aspects because of fiat money. And this is going to take a little bit of explaining, but essentially, what you have are communities that are largely sort of motivated to grow more than maybe grow at all costs almost. And the easiest way to do that with any group is to have sort of like a personality at the center. Somebody that is very dynamic, that is very charming, and that tends to be the head pastor, honestly. And there is some element of that. Now, that person can have very good intentions and so on, but a large part of why you get sort of mega churches, for example, in the United States, is because they have a pastor that is very charming and very, has a really magnetic personality and so on, and they go towards that. But like you said, the bigger thing here is that that's not what we're supposed to do as Christians. We're supposed to follow God, and there's freedom in that. But there's like that sort of like what you're sort of talking about all the way at the beginning, sort of like the institutionalization, the sort of like structure that's almost artificial at times, that causes that spiritual malaise, I think comes from not actually following God. And the reality of being a Christian is actually much more towards follow God. And that is the path to liberty. That is the path to real freedom, because you're free not just from sort of like external trappings or control from other people, but you're free from the actual things that entrap you, which are sin, which are all the deadly sins, greed and lust and gluttony or sloth or whatever. And instead have a real freedom that allows you to truly be expressive of what it is that you're supposed to do. So all of that is to say that I think the Bible and Bitcoin are totally aligned in that regard. Like we were that idea of self-sovereignty instead of sort of dependence on a human institution like fiat money, that's totally biblical to not depend on human institutions, which unfortunately many churches sort of enable a lot of people to do, is to depend not on God, but on sort of like, human, magnetism or something like that. I don't know. Help me out, George. Help me out.
No, I think you said it. I think that's literally the connection. Is just these themes of freedom and liberty and self-sovereignty they're both there. There's a reason that there's a lot of Christians that are attracted to Bitcoin, and there's a reason that a lot of Bitcoiners who maybe grew up Christian but aren't practicing Christians or haven't tapped into their faith in a while or whatever are intrigued by the overlap. Like there's we got to pay attention to these things. And I'm not saying like they're one and the same at all, but I do think that they point to the same themes that we all appreciate about what Bitcoin offers the world. The hope that is underlying all of this is this sovereignty, this freedom. And so I think the question is very on point in that it's just highlighting that there is this overlap. There are these parallels. And so right on, Control Alt BTC. I think your question kind of answers itself at some level. Like there is a strong connection between the two.
Mm. Yeah, indeed. That was a great question. All right, let's go on to the next one. I'm not even sure how to pronounce this Twitter name, but it is at IANUSMANU. Ioannis Manu? I don't know. Although the text starts from a Judeo-Christian premise on debt, how can the increase in the use of Bitcoin in non-Western societies whose philosophical foundations are alien to that tradition be explained?
I would like to phone a friend. Can we call Robert Breedlove on this one, maybe?
Well, he's unfortunately not here, but yeah, give it a shot, man. Let's see what you think.
Yeah, I mean, man, this is a tough one. Well, first of all, I think that other non-Western societies who are basically adopting Bitcoin, maybe even faster than Western societies, that's something to pay attention to. And if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's how do you explain that? How do you explain that adoption? So basically, challenging the notion that of the previous question at some level of the connection between Christianity and Bitcoin. If other sort of non-Christian societies are also seeing the appeal to Bitcoin, is that how you're reading the question too, Jimmy?
Yeah, I think so. It's just sort of like, well, I mean, you're making the argument that it's a Christian thing, but he's saying, well, but how do you explain non-Christians liking it or something like that?
Yeah,
is how I'm interpreting it.
Got it. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that you have to start with the premise on debt being why we need Bitcoin. I think, but I think developing nations. I've always thought this ever since getting into Bitcoin is that it's going to be the hardest for Americans to grasp Bitcoin and its use or its value sort of at a deep level. Whereas if you're in a developing country, you're going to realize it right away. At some level, like we're very comfortable here. We're good, right? Like we are the world reserve currency. We enjoy a high standard of living, even if you're, not doing that well in this country, you're still doing better than most people. And so I think it's really that simple, and I think the temptation as Christians is to kind of be on our high horse and be like, well, you couldn't possibly understand this thing because, it's rooted in self-sovereignty and freedom. And these are all Christian things that we have a monopoly on. And that's just not true, right? Like these are innate human principles, right? Like that anybody can understand if you put it in front of them. And that's why you're seeing Nigeria being I believe it's number 2 country in adoption, is because they innately understand that this is better money than the money that they have. You don't really need to explain it much further than, hey, no other third parties control this. You don't need permission from your government. You don't need permission from your banks. And by the way, there's only 21 million of these ever. So nobody is printing more as you're working hard to earn it. And so I do think it's kind of that simple. I don't think that the sort of quote unquote Judeo-Christian narrative has a monopoly on the human condition.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like there are already lots of incentives, and if you just look at the game theory, the people that are going to benefit the most are the ones that are going to come into it. So, a lot of these people in third world countries, they get it right away because their currencies collapsed maybe once, maybe twice, 3 times in their lifetime already. So for them, it's kind of a no-brainer to go to something that's not like that because U.S. dollars tend to be scarce in all these countries and so on. So, I think what it's pointing to is that there is something like natural law, and I think people recognize that even in countries where they don't have, rights to property and whatnot, they still want it. And this is a way in which people can take back their right to property that's kind of unconfiscatable, that can't be taken away from them. So in a sense, it's attraction to natural law that causes this. And that's, I think, something that, in Christianity, at least, it's sort of a given. We all bear God's image, and therefore we have something called human dignity. We have these rights that are given to us by God, and that means that these are things that we don't have to feel guilty about if like to have our own property. And some people that were born in communist countries, and were educated in those, would actually feel guilty for having private property or something like that. But there is sort of like a natural attraction to natural law. And I think that's what we're talking about here, that's what makes Bitcoin naturally attractive to pretty much all human beings once they really understand what it does.
Amen. Yep.
All right, let's take a look at this other question. This is from at hodling_PNG, who says, some, Kaysen, for example, say Bitcoin / Satoshi are like a second coming or are messianic. Max Kaiser suggests Bitcoin may be a direct gift from God here to save us all. Curious what you think. Could Bitcoin be the new Jesus Christ? Sorry, have not read the book, so maybe a dumb question.
It's a great disclaimer at the end there. All right, you want to take this or me?
You go for it, man.
All right. This is one of my favorite questions. And it's obviously very controversial, but this is kind of my approach. So Jesus today, in the year 2020, sits on the throne. And I think this statement is true if you're a Christian or if you're not a Christian, because we measure time based on his life and based on that narrative, right? So we talked a little bit about this on the Noted podcast too, that like the historical Jesus, few people dispute even that that Jesus was a real historical figure. And so when we say Jesus is king, what we're talking about is no other human up until today has lived a life where 2,000 years later, people are still talking about him and still trying to emulate him, right? That's Jesus. That's who we're talking about. So again, you don't have to be a Christian to embrace that. That's just facts. That's the world that we inhabit. So when we talk about a potential second coming, or we talk about messianic prophecies or whatever, we have to recognize that we don't get to make that call unless this sort of track record is achieved, okay? So whether or not Satoshi is like a second coming can't be answered right now because it's only been 12 years, right? So everything Satoshi has accomplished in these 12 years is very, very impressive. There's no question about it. It's at the level of, I would say, Christ consciousness, in that what Satoshi deployed in the world is addressing so many of humanity's problems that you have to at least tip your hat. You have to at least be like, okay, dude was thinking at a very deep level, right? When Satoshi thought of and released Bitcoin into the world, like it's almost like he thought of everything, right? But to kind of declare or to say, well, this is definitely the second coming of Jesus or whatever, I think it's just premature, if nothing else. I think it's an interesting conversation. I think, like, look, if you're a Christian and you're like, this conversation is making you very uncomfortable, I think pay attention to that, because we obviously live in some really interesting times. We live in some really transitionary times. And we obviously know that when Jesus returns, or when there is a second coming, we're not gonna like be able to it's like when Jesus first came, people didn't recognize him, people didn't know what to expect or who he was. Like, all these things came sort of after the fact. So I think it's equally foolish to be like, no, that's impossible, there's no way. Why not? Why couldn't it be? So I take this question with a very open-handed approach of, it's definitely possible, but it's way too early to sort of make any sort of declaratory statements. Now, I will caveat this with a more sort of direct personal answer and say, like, I hope it's true, because like, we need something. We need saving. We're I don't know if you've noticed, but the world is in just like dire straits at every level. And I don't know about you, but like, if it weren't for Bitcoin, I would probably be like questioning a lot of things. I think I would be pretty depressed on a lot of levels. Like, and I have a pretty good life, I have a lot of really good things going for me. I have a great family, all these kind of things. But as I look at the world, I'm like, what are we going to do? How do we dig ourselves out of this hole? And this is where, like, even just the title of our book, Thank God for Bitcoin, comes in, because it's like there is so much hope and so much potential here that you have to at least acknowledge some fingerprints of the divine in what's going on.
Yeah, I would say that I I wouldn't quite put it at the level of second coming. I think that's like that's a historical event, at least in my mind, that would be very obvious to anybody, and it wouldn't be so hidden, at least according to my theology. So I wouldn't put it that way, but I do think it definitely has a gift like character to it, right? Like it does fix a lot of things. And there have been sort of like technological innovations and things like that, which have made things better, which have prevented a lot of evil and so on, which I think has been good. That this is probably on par with. So in that sense, it is a gift from God. I wouldn't say it has necessarily that much parallels with the second coming. I mean, I think there's maybe some parallels in terms of like the idea of sacrifice and things like that, and Satoshi disappearing.
Yep.
That have some parallels as well. I wouldn't necessarily put any of those things on the order of like biblical prophecy or something. I would say though that this is something that I am excited about, that I do think is like came into the world at an auspicious moment, and like you said, it provides hope for a lot of people. And I mean, I've certainly talked to a lot of my non-Bitcoiner friends, and they are depressed, like seriously depressed, because they haven't seen like their friends in 9 months, and they're constantly scared that something else is going to happen, or that the current situation is horrible, and so on. So, in a sense, like I don't know if Bitcoin is. I don't think Bitcoin is the new Jesus Christ, but Bitcoin is. In a sense, it's a gift to the world.
Yeah. One more thing I'd add to this. My guy at God Says Hodl pointed this out to me. Revelation 2:17 says, "Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches. To the one who is victorious, I will give some of the hidden manna. I will also give that person a white stone with a new name written on it, known only to the one who receives it." And his theory of the white stone, you might have guessed, is the white paper with a new name written on it. So these are just like fun, like theories or whatever. They're not, I don't think they're like prophecy or whatever, but I think the parallels are super interesting. And I think like if as Christians, again, there's nothing to be afraid of. God isn't threatened by these conversations. God isn't up there like, oh my God, they're like considering maybe, something's going on. But I'm like, God's fine. Just chill. Let's have these conversations. Let's have them openly, and let's explore. Let's try to figure out what's happening in the world.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfectly fair way to go about it. There are too many people that are like, oh no, I can't ever hear anything that might be heretical.
Right.
That's not at least how I approach my faith, and I think anyone who does is I don't know. It's kind of it's the ability to withstand things, and like the closing your ears and saying la 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 is more the realm of the atheist these days anyway.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to the last question here that I want to cover. At Parker Muse on Twitter asks, as this book seems to tie in elements of faith, what is the proper attitude to have towards Bitcoin or crypto in general? I ask this because it is evident that many are over-leveraged emotionally and mentally, and I've seen too many tweets mimicking religious rhetoric.
Wow. That's a good question. I like how he says over leveraged emotionally and mentally, but not financially. Just leaves that one out.
Oh, well, that's a given, obviously.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So proper attitude, I think, is I just got to shout out Matt Odell on this one. I mean, stay humble, stack sats. I think honestly, this is one of the most, if I can use the word prophetic, I think this is one of the most prophetic memes that we have in the space, because it's so, especially now as we're sort of entering new all-time high territory, it's so just like future oriented. As the price goes up, our need to stay humble is ever present. And so I think that is the first thing to say about proper attitude. I know I have to keep myself in check. There's a lot of people that I want to call or text and be like, told you so. But like, that's not a very Christian attitude, right? That's not a very godly attitude. That's not, it's not helpful. Even if you're a non-religious person, it just doesn't do anything. And so I think, again, stay humble, keep stacking sats, because I think that is an important part of like the conviction that drives all of this, that like there is something to this that is important. And I think conviction is there's something about what we're up against, right? And we talk about this a lot in the book, being able to have the conviction that says, no, the old system, what we've been doing is not only broken and not working and not effective, but it's wrong. It's morally corrupt, right? And in order to be able to do that with confidence, you have to have something else to stand in a practical way, right? And so I think that's part of it. But really to address the question of like, I think the deeper question of like, how do you avoid making Bitcoin like your new God, right? I think that it goes hand in hand with staying humble, right? And just recognizing that this is a tool. This is a tool. This is not a God. Don't worship it. It's not your salvation. It's not going to save you from being an asshole. It's not going to save you from being a jerk. Like you still have to work your own stuff out. You still have to be a human in the present moment. You still have to interact with other humans. And so Bitcoin is a tool. And if you are one of the fortunate people to be here this early and have received this gift, and to use a biblical phrase, have been found ready to receive this gift, then I think that requires and calls you to be even more humble and be like, wow, what part of my life story has led me here to where I get to receive this gift? And now what Luke 12:48 says, to whom much is given, much is expected. What is my responsibility now? What do I do with this gift? And I think that's the proper attitude is we got to receive this almost with fear and trembling, right? And 23K right now, as of today, is if Bitcoin does what we believe it's going to do, is peanuts compared to kind of the wealth and the power that we're coming into. And with that comes great responsibility. And so people of faith, I think, have to receive that with fear and trembling and begin thinking about, what does that look like? What does stewardship of that gift look like, both today and into the future?
Yeah, all excellent points. There's definitely a stewardship element to it, and things like that. I want to take it in a slightly different direction, because there's also a lot of temptations along the way, right? And altcoins being the major one. And that's unfortunately way too common. And a lot of people sort of fall prey to that because, in a sense, they're not receiving Bitcoin as the gift that it is. There's a temptation to kind of get greedy and think that you're the genius because you happen to have found this thing. And now you found like 7 other things that sort of look like it, and now you can make tons more money. That, I think, is the path that a lot of people have taken, and it's led them down the wrong way. And it's a lot of people have gotten wrecked as a result of that. I mean, that's not to say that there are people that are able to successfully make money doing that, but it's a very different thing than using it for its sort of intended purpose, which I think is storing value. It's using it to at least in its usage right now, it's very useful as a store of value. Instead, like trying to go find uses for something like Ripple, which doesn't really have a use, but and getting wrecked as a result. That to me is the real danger. And there's a over leveraging emotionally and mentally into these other things way more than there is sometimes in Bitcoin. So like a lot of people that are into altcoins, they get so emotionally involved because that becomes sort of like their identity, right? Like I am a Litecoiner, or I'm a hex person or whatever. It's like they get into it, and they almost see themselves primarily as that, and it becomes sort of like their tribe, and they don't really get, like, for them that's sort of like the purpose is for that to give them an identity, and this, I think, is at the heart of what it, like sort of valuing it properly, which is to not put it too high. I think fiat money has a tendency to make us sort of worship it almost, and put us into a monetary Stockholm syndrome where we, worship, or we love the very thing that enslaves us or something like that. And not too low either, right? Like where you don't care about money at all, and, you just sort of like dismiss it as beneath you. But to properly value it, put it in its right, correct place, which is as a tool for, storing value, and to use it properly with good stewardship and all of the other things that you said. That is really where we're supposed to be. But unfortunately, it's way too easy to, put it like too high or too low. Too low tends to be sort of like the no coiners, and too high tends to be more the altcoiners or whatever. But regardless, like finding that right balance, and giving it the proper amount of attention, emotionally, mentally, intellectually, or whatever, that is the real trick, and that's going to be. I'm not going to sit here and tell you, 32 minutes a day is the right amount or whatever. But there is sort of like, the amount of attention that you put towards it, that at least as a Christian, that you got to be aware of, to not fall on either side, which I think way too many people do.
Yeah. Well said. Beautiful.
All right. So any final words for our audience regarding our book, or pretty much Christianity, or anything at all? Any messages to any of them?
Yeah, I think definitely get the book. This is a great book. I'm so proud of the work that we did, honestly. Like, I'm very excited about the reception it's received. Thank you to everybody who's already supported it and bought it and read it. And I guess just kind of last word is, we are in a really interesting time in humanity, and what's happening, I think, is calling all of us to a higher consciousness, a higher way of being. And I think it's really important for anybody who's listening to pay attention to that, to pay attention to what however you hear from God, however you experience God, however, even if you're not religious, you have something innate in you that comes from something outside of you that you listen to and that you follow. And it's what's led you here, right? And I just think it's incumbent on all of us to really tune in and really pay attention to that right now, perhaps more than ever before. I'm in my 30s, and I feel like now more than any other time in my life is a time to wake up and to pay attention and to be alert. And when God calls us, that we are found ready, that we are, our response is, here I am. What can I do? What are you calling me to? And so that's kind of my parting words is let's wake up. Let's go into the new year wide awake, ready for whatever comes next.
A good message indeed. I have two that I want to share. The first is for people in the church, and this is something that's been very frustrating for me, especially the last 9 months. I would like to see the church be a lot bolder. And what I've seen, I think the last 9 months have more or less proved is that, not many people are that bold, right? Like there's a meme going around of, Christians in 65 AD, Emperor Nero says, I'm going to feed you to the lions. And the Christian says, I will gladly do that for the glory of my God. 2020, Gavin Newsom says, I'm going to fine you $5,000 if you go to church on Sunday. And the Christian says, thank you for keeping me safe, right? Like there's something horrible about the lack of courage or the courage that's missing from Christians today. I would like to see more of that fire, that desire to serve God, that following him really entails. And I think to George's point, like I see that more among Bitcoiners than I do Christians, which something's really off about that, right? Like that shouldn't be the case. There should be the church should be a beacon of courage, of people that are bold, that are even if not agreed with, admired for what they're able to do and what changes that they're trying, and sort of like a respect that you get even if they don't agree with you, because wow, these people actually really believe what they're doing, instead of sort of like the hypocritical reputation that many Christians have. So that would be message one. Message two would be to the Bitcoiners, which is that it's all having sound money is good, but to what end? I would ask you, like, what is the end goal that you want to see? And I would hope that most of you would say something like a better civilization, something legacy related. Bitcoin, as we say, helps you think much more long term. And if you're thinking ultimately long term, you have to ask yourself about, what is my eternal destiny, right? And I'm not just asking metaphorically, as in, what's going to happen to your children and your descendants or whatever, but about you. What's the most practical thing that you can do to do something for yourself eternally? And that's a question worth exploring. And especially if you have some experience in the church, that's I would encourage you to go and read some of that stuff, because there are some eternal principles, some capital T truths that can help in figuring that out. So that would be my last word there. Love it.
Thanks for having me on. This was fun.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I didn't know exactly how it would go, but here we are. All right. Anyway, that was great, George. Thanks for being on. Where can people find you?
So I'm on Twitter at Mekhail, at GMEKHAIL. I also co-founded bitcoinis.com, which is a resource center for Bitcoin. And we also have a store where you can get the book as well as some merchandise. So check it out.
Yeah. And by the way, George is recording the audio book. So
that's true.
Don't get it out, then you can
blame me. Yeah, just at me. I'm working on it. Work in progress.
All right. Thanks. Well, that wraps it up for this episode of Bitcoin Fixes This. George can be found at Twitter at Mekhail, and our book can be found on Amazon. Thank God for Bitcoin. Until next time, fiat delenda est.